Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi there. I'm your host, Michael Howard, the head of marketing at Infotools, and this is Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. Today, we're joined by Jo Secher, a freelance researcher. Jo moved to New Zealand in 2011 at 21 when he was offered funding to pursue a PhD at the University of Otago. His PhD was in social cognition, and in particular, the role emotion plays in how people perceive risk. He graduated in 2015 and decided he wanted to move into commercial research. He began his career at Kantar, and since then he has headed up the research functions at Blind Low Vision NZ and Whakaata Māori, formerly Māori Television. He also serves as a NextGen board member of the Research Association of New Zealand. Thanks for coming on the show today, Jo.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I've been listening to your podcast for nearly a year, and I cannot tell you how delighted I am to be here. I can scarcely believe I'm appearing on a podcast that's hosted luminaries like Ray Pointer and Daryl Bricker. I listened to Lauren Cheetham episode last week as well. I hadn't heard of her before, but I thought she was marvelous. Anyway, thrilled to be here.
And I'm excited that you're joined us as well. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you. So what is the most significant thing you're going to talk with us about today, Jo?
Well, Michael, I've sort of noticed during my career client side and medium-sized organizations that quantitative data is frequently misinterpreted by staff in other departments. Often, I feel like researchers could do more to prevent this sort of potentially disastrous misconstrual happening. I'm keen to talk about this in the wider context of an information environment where fact is increasingly difficult to distinguish from fiction, and the role research professionals have to play as credible fact checkers in a world with far too few.
So if we just take a step back for a moment, what leads you to the observation that facts are increasingly difficult to tell apart from fiction?
Actually, what brought this whole idea of misinformation to my attention was my own failure to spot misinformation that, to my discredit, I had already repeated multiple times to other people. For at least a couple of years previously, I believed this often cited statistic that something like 2/3 of lottery winners go bankrupt within a few years of winning the jackpot. I only found out that I was wrong about this when I repeated it to my partner, who retorted that actually research had found that lottery winners typically blow a few tens of thousands on a nice car, boat, holiday, or whatever, and then invest the rest and go to live pleasant, comfortable lives after that. I started to wonder why I had believed that and what it told me about myself, and I realized that I was guilty of a kind of elitist snobbery. I don't play the lottery myself because I know the chances of winning it are infinitesimal. So I suppose in some way I must look down on people who do play it, kind of like they're not clever enough to realize they're wasting their money. And then it follows from that on the occasion when they prove me wrong by spending a couple of dollars on Powerball and then winning millions of dollars, they somehow didn't deserve it. And so I found it easy to convince myself that because these people won a large sum of money they didn't deserve, they couldn't possibly keep it. They'll spend it frivolously and end up broke and penniless. And while that might be a compelling narrative, there's a problem with it. It's just not true. Anyway, I started looking into this idea that misinformation is becoming more of a problem. In 2023, a pollster found that over 30% of Americans believed the 2020 election was stolen, which it wasn't. Over in the UK, disinformation about the perpetrator of a horrific massacre sparked nationwide race riots. New Zealand, of course, has its fair share of people who believe that 5G is a government conspiracy to control them and damage their health. So these are all examples of how I feel like misinformation is gaining more cut through now than it perhaps would have done in an earlier age. Not that the idea of misinformation is new in itself.
Why do you think misinformation seems to be a more acute problem now than in the past?
I think the reason why boundaries between fantasy and reality are breaking down is because there's just so much information out there now. So there's a paradox at play. Intuitively, you might imagine that more available information would ultimately lead to better understanding. It's a kind of rationalist Enlightenment era principle, an ideal, that in an arena with many raucous voices competing, the cream rises to the top. But that doesn't seem to have been what's happened at all. Why not? I suppose the answer is that with so much out there, it gets increasingly impossible to tell the signal apart from the noise. So that's one reason. The other reason is the mass democratization of the information space. Previously, there were gatekeepers to information: authors, publishers, journalists, archivists, religious institutions, broadcast media, etc., etc. The bar to becoming a gatekeeper was typically fairly high. Would-be gatekeepers were subject to a heavy amount of peer review before admittance, and after becoming gatekeepers, they were usually able to dedicate most of their time to the job of sourcing information, curating it for their audience, and then deciding how to communicate it to them. Of course, they had their own biases, but to a greater or lesser degree, their pride and professional reputation depended on not being seen to make egregious factual errors. Such constraints have largely fallen by the wayside now. Anybody can publish. Theoretically, anyone has the potential to reach an absolutely massive audience. And most critically, there is no inbuilt quality control mechanism anymore. In fact, just yesterday, I was reading about Mark Zuckerberg's decision to axe Meta's entire fact-checking team. And the reason why the truth doesn't rise to the top, as enlightened philosophers might have imagined, is that it's genuinely very difficult for people to accurately assess the validity of information that we're presented with, especially about subjects we're unfamiliar with. It's a full-time job, and put simply, normal people with normal full-time jobs just don't have the time.
So why would you say, why do you think this matters then? Why is it so important to focus on?
10 years ago, I never would have imagined myself now talking about why facts matter. But this has genuinely become a matter of contention in public discourse. Kellyanne Conway, former counsel to the President of the United States, infamously introduced the concept of alternative facts in 2017. During the second US presidential debate, the president-elect made an entirely fabricated allegation involving the small town of Springfield, Ohio, which I won't repeat. And his running mate then went on air afterwards and effectively said that it didn't matter whether a story was true, provided it directed attention to issues that matter. But facts do matter. Reality matters. When Hans Christian Andersen's emperor paraded in front of his subjects, convinced he was wearing clothes that didn't actually exist, everybody could see that he was naked. If you hold a glass aloft in the air and then you drop it, the glass will fall to the floor. This is because of gravity, and it makes no difference whether you believe in or even know about gravity. If you emit greenhouse gases for nearly 2 centuries in ever-increasing quantities, they will trap heat in the atmosphere, and the average temperature will rise. And to make it more relevant, in the marketing world, you may well think that your untested product will be snapped up by hungry consumers at a 2,000% markup. But if you then put it into production, and it turns out you were wrong, you stand to lose a large amount of real money, and no amount of wishful thinking can change that.
Or alternative reporting as well.
Precisely so, Michael.
Yes.
Agreed.
So now, returning to how this intersects with market research, where does the research profession come in?
Perhaps surprisingly, according to Horizon Research, who are based here in New Zealand, market research is actually one of the more trusted professions. When you compare us to journalists, politicians, bankers, or even our esteemed cousins in the marketing profession, we really come out quite well. We tend to score levels of trust closer to scientists, doctors, and teachers. So we're more likely to be seen as benign, impartial seekers of truth than cynical charlatans out to manipulate people for our own benefit. I think we would do really well to remember and fulfill that expectation of us. I truly believe that most people go into market research because at heart they're curious and they kind of just can't help themselves. So to maintain our professionalism, we have to show the strength of character to resist the temptation to blur the line between market research and marketing itself. In the end, when we maintain a healthy psychological distance, the result is better for everyone, marketers and researchers alike.
Mm. So does this come down to a question of maintaining professional ethics then?
Yes, absolutely. Members of the Research Association of New Zealand, or RANZ, are bound to follow its code of practice. Now, the code of practice talks about a lot of topics like the commitment researchers must have to serving their clients, participant consent, confidentiality, data storage. But I'd like to talk specifically about a dilemma that most client-side researchers have probably faced at some point during their career, which is the pressure to use market research as a kind of pretext for something else. Often this will be an opportunity to promote their employer's product, but not necessarily. Without going into too much detail, in one of my previous roles, I was asked to run some research about what percentage of respondents supported a campaign my organization wanted to run. I discovered that the intention was to send round an email extensively elaborating on all the reasons why our campaign was worthy of their support, and then asking them to take part in a survey about whether they supported it or not. This is the kind of thing that makes a mockery of research. Of course, nobody who disagreed with the contents of the email would agree to take the survey and then say that they didn't support our campaign. What they wanted to do was similar to the unethical practice of review gating, where businesses only direct you to leave a review of them on Google if you have already said you enjoyed their product. When I voiced my objection, the marketing team reacted with genuine surprise. When I explained what the problem was, they accepted my judgment and they weren't angry with me or anything. I think they just really genuinely hadn't thought about it before. I also remember a more typical example of what the code of practice refers to as sugging, or selling under the guise of market research. In that situation, I was briefed to write a questionnaire that ostensibly asked what people thought about our services, but which was actually employed to generate sales leads. To reiterate my earlier point, it's so important that we maintain an arm's length relationship with sales activity, partly in the interest of the integrity of our whole profession, but also because selling under the guise of research gradually chips away at the trust people generously place in us. And once that trust is gone, no one will be able to gain reliable insights through research anymore because nobody will agree to talk to us.
And that's just not something that you would erode for yourself as a market researcher or the organization you're working for or representing, but everyone in the industry as well.
I think that's yeah, Michael, I agree. I think that's how I'd put it. I mean, the way I see it, and sorry to any of my past and future employers out there, but your first loyalty as a market researcher is to the market research profession. Your second loyalty after that is to whoever's employing you or who or your clients. And the reason for that is because it's kind of like a sort of a tragedy of the commons phenomenon. It might be very tempting to seek some immediate gain from violating some of the principles of ethical research, like sneakily trying to give somebody a brochure at the same time as administering a survey to them, and in so doing, maybe generating a sales lead. And in the very short term, that might work. But the overall effect is to kind of poison the well for all other researchers who follow in your footsteps after that. And ultimately, there's a reason why people hire market researchers, which is because they want to find things out about their services and products, and they want to know more about the market. They can't do that if we gradually erode all of the goodwill that's in our proverbial fields.
That's right. So, what you've just mentioned prior to that little segue or tangent were ethical examples of unethical conduct market researchers should avoid. But when you talk about integrity and insights, do you have anything else in mind?
Yes, in my experience, far more common than unethical practice is straightforward misinterpretation of data. And I think this is an area where market researchers really need to take responsibility. Something that I have noticed is that when you present statistics to non-technical audiences, they generally take them at face value. Part of the reason why ties into what I was saying before. People inherently tend to believe what they're told. It's just too much effort to interrogate all the information that crosses our paths. It's not cognitively feasible. But the other part is that I sometimes get a feeling that professionals unfamiliar with research can, on occasion, put researchers and data analysts on something of a pedestal.
I mean, you've also got there are a number of things that could be leading to this, like correlation, causation, etc. Like just because you see something at face value, it may look quite like you've connected dots, but there could be other dots which are far more influential.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I sometimes feel like the way that market researchers present their work doesn't sufficiently apprise their audiences of the level of uncertainty that's inherent in basically all research. And by its nature, pretty much all research is probabilistic. We're saying, if you introduce this product, we think it's probably with, I don't know, like a 60 or 70% chance, it's probably going to turn a profit for you. And it's the same with assessing almost anything else. When we talk to people, we're not talking to every single person in a population. We're talking to a sample of them. And I feel like that possibly sets some of our deliverables apart from, for example, the work that an accounting team presents, where they're basically telling you this is what your outgoings were and this is what your ingoings were, and this is what your balance is now. I think it's just a different way of assimilating information that we need to get our stakeholders on board with.
I mean, the very fact that the industry is so at ease with the term margin of error. There are not many industries out there that push the idea of error in what they're serving you with as well. So it's something that we're very clear to make known to people with what we're presenting.
It's true, but I think we need to possibly even go a bit further than that. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on this podcast, but I happen to listen to another podcast called The News Agents, which talks about global politics. It's based in the UK, but it talks about politics all over the world. And a renowned election analyst, originally a baseball analyst, Nate Silver, ran 8,000 models simulating the results of the previous US presidential election. Now, we know what the result of that was now. But when he ran those models, he found that 4,017 of those models predicted a Kamala Harris win, and 3,983 predicted a Donald Trump win. Now, an analyst, if you're a quantitative analyst, you would look at that and you'd go, okay, so they're exactly the same. That's 50-50. There is no difference. But that wasn't the way it was reported. The host of that podcast, who I massively admire as a journalist, Emily Maitlis, reported it as saying, so Kamala Harris has a slight edge. That's information that most listeners can't really process, because the reality is maybe slight, but actually it's so slight that it really is seriously not even worth mentioning. It's like saying if your brand awareness slips maybe 1 percentage point behind another brand that it was previously equal within a sample of 500 people, you could look at that and go, oh no, we must do something to hastily turn everything around, but you really wouldn't be right to. At that point, you just have to say, this is not necessarily measuring anything real at all. I think that's where we need to be clear in our communication.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, the last point you mentioned was interesting because I guess last week, Lauren Cheetham seemed to be saying the opposite, where people are skeptical of market research and that we need to prove our value. So where does this sit with what you're saying?
Yeah, I think both can be true at the same time. On the one hand, market research professionals tend to have trouble quantifying return on investment, which is perhaps ironic for a profession which dedicates considerable time and resources to measuring things. So that can sometimes be a sticking point for purse string holders who can't directly enumerate the contribution research makes to the bottom line. But on the other hand, I feel like there's something about our quantitative work, especially, that a lot of people find vaguely mysterious. A significant proportion of children go through school hating maths. And when they leave, they feel profoundly uncomfortable with numbers, which is a terrible pity. Hating any discipline at school is sad, but I think with maths, it's particularly problematic because everywhere we are unavoidably surrounded by data, whether that's numbers in a bank balance, outlandish claims made by politicians or lobby groups, or discount percentages in advertising. So people know numbers are important, but they don't like them and they don't understand them. So I think some folks have a tendency to kind of park their critical thinking when they're presented with statistics. That makes it all the more important that when we present data, we do it in a way that empathizes with how those data are likely to be understood.
Mm. Can you cite any examples of where this kind of thing has happened?
Yes, I'll never forget when I was working at Fakata Mori and someone, I think it was the commissioning manager, came up to me and said that one of the shows we had released earlier that year, which was targeted at 15 to 24-year-old Pacifica audience, had mainly been watched by 65 plus year old New Zealand European men living in Canterbury. I was very surprised when I heard that. I'd seen the show myself and it made no sense to me that 65 and over year old men would be its primary audience. But also 65 plus year old men who live in Canterbury simply aren't a particularly large proportion of the New Zealand population. I tried to work out what had happened, and it turned out that the commissioning manager had picked up this nugget of information from a routine show performance pack our team produced. We made them for every show, and they followed a standardized format. First, a slide showing the audience makeup on linear television, and then a slide showing the digital audience. Now, the linear television audience is estimated from a sample of something like 2,000 household set-top boxes in New Zealand. So it's quite old school. Now, Fakata Mori is a growing but still distinctly niche channel, watched by a minority of households in New Zealand. This particular show was also not one of our most popular. For some reason, the software that relayed this information to us took the number of households watching a show, divided it by 2,000 or whatever the average size of the household composition is, and then effectively scaled it up to reflect the total population of New Zealand. So the software might show that 7,523 viewers had watched one of our shows, but in reality, that amounted to one household. So that is a tiny and totally unreliable sample size. What I suspect happened is that purely by chance, a couple of 65 and over men in Canterbury were flicking through channels, stuck around just long enough on Fakata Māori to register as a viewer of this new show. And then our report gave the impression that a swathe of culturally interested male retirees had suddenly taken an interest in Pacifica youth culture. The digital data told a completely different, far more sensible, and far more reliable story. But because of how the pack was presented, the linear television slide was more salient. So that was the message the commissioning manager took home. We really needed, in those circumstances, to present that information differently. I want to tell you also about one more example. This is from when I was working at Blind Low Vision New Zealand. And what happened then was the communications manager told me that 40% of our clients lived in Wellington. That immediately struck me as odd. We were a nationwide organization, and our offices were based in Parnell. Now, there are characteristics of the membership of Blind Low Vision New Zealand that make it unrepresentative of the New Zealand population as a whole. Most notably, vision loss in most cases is the result of age-related decline. So about half of our membership was over the age of 75. But still, only 10% of New Zealand's population lives in Wellington. Could the elderly population possibly be that overrepresented in Wellington? It's not especially known as the preserve of older folk in the way that places like Tauranga or Thames are. Could it be that there's a high concentration of rest homes that specifically cater to people with failing vision in Wellington? Could it be that at some point in the past we'd run an especially successful campaign that specifically targeted the Wellington area? It won't surprise you to hear that it was none of those things. For some reason or another, someone had decided some year previously to label more or less the whole of the North Island south of Auckland as Wellington entirely arbitrarily. So when the communications manager looked at that and thought, we need to focus on Wellington-based publications, she didn't realize that her definition of Wellington was completely different to the definition used by the person who made the graph she'd read.
Wow, I mean, both those examples are quite striking, aren't they? And which just makes you ask the question, what can we do to avert such strategic decision-making errors that have been based on misinterpreted data?
We have to appreciate that our role is not just to report the numbers, but also to interpret them. Especially when you're following a standardized process, there can be a tendency to fall into a kind of mechanized mindset where you're on autopilot, not really thinking a report through as you're populating it. That's where you need to take a step back and see the wood for the trees. Ask, how is this going to be seen by its intended audience? Try and see things from their perspective. Numbers that might seem important to us as researchers might not matter to some of our stakeholders. And conversely, numbers that we had largely overlooked might really jump out at them. Also, if we're presenting the report in person, we need to read the room. Look around, see how and when people are reacting. Try to discern whether the reaction is consistent with the story we think the numbers are telling. And if it's not, be sure to have a conversation afterwards to ascertain how the report has been received. Above all, apply a common sense filter to the data you're presenting. Make sure it passes the sniff test. 19 times out of 20, if something looks wrong, it is due to measurement error, a data collection error, a data processing error, or even a typo. This is where experience and familiarity with the data you're working with really pays dividends. You can be a highly skilled, meticulously accurate analyst, but sometimes there's no substitute for old-fashioned intuition.
I mean, one thing that we're quite big on and have been since the formation of our company is co-creation or co-generation of insights. So it begs the question, when you see something that is significant and it stands out from what typically has been, go and ask a stakeholder that is common with the data set, common with what it is you're researching, and just run it by them and just saying, hey, look, initial findings are suggesting this here has happened, but it doesn't quite sit right with me. Like, what's your take on it?
That's exactly the kind of procedure that I think you'd be very well advised to follow. I mean, it does assume that you have someone on hand who is sufficiently familiar with the area, and more importantly, the nuances of the data in it, so that you can fall back on that person's judgment. And then there's another cog in the machine as well, which is you, the researcher. And I guess the point that I'm talking about in that last bit I was just saying there was the role that you as the researcher have, because you need to flag that before it even gets to that person. Otherwise, they may not even notice it. Somebody else might notice it, and that person might be instinctively less familiar with the area, and they might just accept it at face value. You can imagine how, in that earlier example I was giving with the show targeted at a young Pacifica audience, if the commissioning manager takes the insight from the linear television presentation slide at face value, she might just go, all right, well, we're cancelling that because we have no remit to target 65 and over-year-old white men in Canterbury. But she would have been seriously mistaken. That's the kind of thing that I'm referring to when I talk about catastrophically bad strategic errors caused by researchers not equipping their audience with the skills they need to interpret the data.
No, I think this is a really important topic that you've been talking about today, Jo. Any final thoughts on the subject before we close?
No, I don't think I really have any more to say about it for now, Michael, but I'm happy to discuss any further examples of data misconstrual, ways of presenting data that can make it more ergonomic, more accessible for audience. Just feel free to get in touch with me. I'm on LinkedIn. My name is spelled J-O, so without the E. And then Secher is S for sugar and then E-C-H-E-R. Just get in touch with me, and I'd absolutely love to have a conversation about it.
Well, Jo, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
My absolute pleasure, Michael. Thank you so very much for having me on.
You're welcome. And to all our listeners out there, if you have enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate you sharing it with others, subscribing to the podcast, and leaving a review as well. Until next time, thanks for listening to Now That's Significant.